Hello, I'm Donal McCauley, and welcome to this Medics Voices conversation, where we talk to the key opinion leaders in health and medicine around the world. Today, we're talking to Glyn Elwyn, who's usually based in the USA, but currently talking to us from Denmark. Glyn, you've had the fascinating career. You've brought us right from Wales to the US via the Netherlands and London and various other academic institutions. Tell me where it all began.
I guess it began in North Wales, right? That's where I'm from, really, from the Conway Valley. Some of you will know Snowdonia. I grew up on a farm there, so that's where it began. And I went to school, and I was really into biology and chemistry, and I had a home laboratory actually. And because of the ether on my shelf, I was involved in a fire. Went to hospital and all that. So and I gave up science at that point because I thought, oh, this is a dangerous thing. And I did the arts actually. I did Welsh language and theatre, went to Bangor University in North Wales. And then I kind of regretted that and said to the professor of Welsh at the time, maybe I'd like to go to medical school. So that's a bit of a complicated story, but I eventually ended up in medical school in South Wales.
So you went to medical school, you trained in general practice, and then you followed an academic general practice career.
Yeah, that took a little while. I was working in the docks actually in Cardiff, Tiger Bay as it used to be called, where there was a West Caribbean population. The homeless were there, the drug users were there, and the people from the Horn of Africa after the war there were coming through, Somali families. So I had a bit of a tough, deprived general practice. And yeah, I got into teaching general practitioners what was called continuing medical education, CME, as it were. And then I did a master's in medical education, and I liked writing for some reason, and the more I did of it, the more I liked it, and that led me to a PhD with Richard Groll in the Nijmegen, actually, and he was a wonderful mentor. Still have lots of contact with Richard in Nijmegen, and that was the step in which took me really to academia, really.
Well, that was a big international step at a time when most people did their PhDs more locally. So you had a pretty international perspective even at that stage.
Yes, so, the Dutch do a PhD by publication, where you put together five, in my case, six papers published in peer review, then you defend them publicly. I liked that idea because I had no papers when I was starting, right? And I was in my 40s, really. So I had no papers, no publications, and no research background, really. And so that gave me a good founding in how to write a paper, how to collect some data, how to do research. And yeah, that's where it all started with Richard Groll's mentorship, really.
So you've done the PhD, then you move into a chair. Tell us about that progression.
Yeah, I know. Well, they were setting up a new medical school, a graduate medical school in Swansea. So I was there with Adrian Edwards, a lifetime colleague of mine, as you know. We went there for a couple of years. Was invited back to Cardiff, actually, to have a chair there, the distinguished research chair at the time. And, the opportunity came to go to the US, to Dartmouth College for a secondment. And I said, well, I'll go for 2 years. But would you know, that 2 years changed into more than a decade, actually, because I managed to recruit some postdocs and other good people, and I didn't want to abandon them after 2 years. So I stayed. So that's where I am now.
Now, you quietly said you moved to Dartmouth, but I remember when you moved, and that was a fascinating move. Tell us, tell us more about that. How you moved, the people that you met, what inspired you to change career essentially.
It was, yes. And I didn't carry on doing clinical medicine there because it's a big uphill journey to become a doctor there, as you know. So I didn't do residency there. Well, the reason was that Jack Wemberg was there. He was the pioneer in medical practice variation research. Elliot Fisher was there. Gil Welsh was there. like a really strong group of pioneering thinkers in shared decision making and in practice variation. And it was attractive to join them. And there were also people there from Boston, like Al Mully, and Michael Barry was connected with Al Mully. So a very strong group in this concept called shared decision making. And I was asked really to join a unit that wanted me to build up a research group on this topic of shared decision making. Jim Kim was there as a president at the time before he went to the World Bank. So suddenly I was in the middle of these, what I considered, academic giants, essentially, in the field. So that I felt was an opportunity I couldn't turn down from, when was it? Oh, about 2012. And then I said, how long am I going to stay here? And I managed to negotiate a budget to bring some postdocs there. And I managed to find some good people from Australia, from France, and from Ireland to join me there. And that was new for Dartmouth, for them to actually have a gang of people with an international feeling about them. And I think we did okay. We managed some grants and so on.
So tell us the different steps now where you began to expand this shared decision-making idea.
Yeah, so I have to give credit to Al Mully. He came to Cardiff, to the Welsh office, before the assembly was even born, right? In, I think it was late 90s or something like this. He was talking about decision aids and some tools they'd built to predict risk and to share decisions with patients. This was a new idea for me, for many doctors, I think. And I looked into that and began to work on it in Cardiff. I took the idea to Nijmegen, to Richard Grohl, and we built a measure can we measure the degree to which clinicians are offering patients choices, talking to them about which of these choices are good for them, which ones they prefer. And that line of work has carried on, and I managed to recruit, as I said, some good people. We began to build more decision aids called option grids, actually, which are tables that basically list the options and ask you 6 or 7 questions about what's involved, what are the harms, what are the benefits, and what other things do you need to know before making a choice. So those tools, I think, have given me a lifeline in research because we've evaluated whether they work or not, essentially.
Let's talk about those decision aids because they are very clinically orientated and help people make up their mind about, management of breast cancer and various things. So tell me, take me through those various steps.
In Cardiff, I was building one of these tools with a colleague on prostate PSA testing and also on breast cancer. And it's a big decision aid, had lots of content, and it was web-based. And we analyzed which bit of the web-based tool people were looking at, spending time on. And we've got a lot of text, lots of content, lots of things to read. If you read the whole thing, it would have taken you about a good half an hour at least. So we noticed that most people were going to a table where we'd ask some questions and put the options on the top row. That's where they were spending their time. They were doing these trade-off and comparisons. So we said, well, if that's where people are spending their time, maybe that's what we need to develop. We don't need all this writing and this content. And I think it's proven to be true that people, if you're trying to do this within a healthcare encounter, a consultation, you need something brief. You can give things for people to take home and read, but what they really want is a conversation with a clinician who knows what they're talking about, but opportunity then to ask questions and to trying to collaborate on this tough decision. So we made them more of those tools and began some trials. We found that they were working. People liked them, doctors liked them, junior doctors liked them very much because they gave them lots of evidence-based information very quickly, summarized in a way that they could understand and then translate into their patients' understanding. So even now, we're still working on these tools. And what we're discovering is that even though they are brief, there are a lot to digest within a single visit. So we're working on trying to get these to patients before a visit so that they've at least understood what the choices are, what are the main issues. And what we're finding is that if you manage to get these tools to patients before the visit becomes even more efficient. They start from a better place. They've got a better understanding. They ask much better questions. And the clinician doesn't have to do all that work of talking. They can just respond to questions. And in some situations, it saves time. So it's preloading the patient with a lot of information, if you like. And that, I think, in the current healthcare environment of being efficient is really something to strive for. Anyway, all to say that the tools are only one small facet of a better conversation, in my view. It takes a lot of skill to do this well. And I'm working with people like Paul Gulbrandsen in Oslo about what are the essential communication skills that mean you should slow down and listen more rather than talk more. It's very difficult for clinicians to do that, actually.
Now, you've come to an area that's quite interesting, and that is, how can we widen our perspective from simply thinking as clinicians to thinking in the other dimensions of communication? Because you've done work on the psychological readiness, and you've also talked about communication. So talk around the subject for a while.
I will mention Paul again, called Paul Gulbrandsen from Oslo. He's probably one of the pioneers in studying linguistics and the psychological nuances of communication. And he's got a lovely metaphor, actually, if you're dealing with somebody where the information is new, and this is a patient who's got a new diagnosis, or you're giving them a problem to solve, such as what are we going to right thing to do here? What's the decision? He's got this concept of, if you're giving information, you need to give it slowly and check. So the metaphor he's got is giving a child some food when they're not able to yet feed themselves. If you give a spoon, they take it. You need to pause before giving the next spoon, right? A time to digest. This is the processing time that people need for processing information, cognitive processing. And there's a book that he recommended to me, How We Talk, and the gaps between questions and answers, leaving a gap of at least 0.2 of a second, probably more, for people to digest, absorb, and then respond. So micro details of conversations, so that if you keep talking, people are not going to engage and enter what I call a psychologically safe space to really work with you.
I was interested in this business of the psychological readiness to think about the decision aids.
Right. And I've been talking to people like Alf Collins and Paul about this issue. I developed a model called the 3-talk model. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but I categorize shared decision-making into 3 forms of talk: team talk, option talk, and decision talk. The team talk is what you're referring to now about this psychologically safe space, to generate quickly enough compassion, trust, empathy, so that people feel that even though you're asking them to do something new and difficult, like involve themselves in a decision, they feel able to join you in that process. So that's what Amy Edmondson called a psychological safe zone, right? Where I feel I trust you enough to ask you questions and even to disagree with you a little bit about, well, my priorities are different. My views are different to your views, because we showed actually in California that patients are very hesitant to disagree with their clinicians.
Now, when you talk about Amy Edmondson and you talk about our Norwegian colleagues, we're bringing the non-clinical into the clinical space. Mm-hmm. So how do we bring that message to the clinicians? How do we bring it into practice?
Yeah, well, I'm here in Denmark, actually, updating the 3-talk model. And the metaphor I'm using is that think of a safe where you keep your most valuable things. There are keys to that safe and that clinicians can use. I think it's something like this. I'm not quite sure yet of the exact keys to this psychologically safe space where patients feel free to talk, but it's got to involve something like curiosity. I want to know, Domhnall, what makes you tick? Who is in your life? What do you value? What brings you joy? Unless I make that personal connection with you, you're not going to share with me what you really feel and think. So curiosity. Competence is one, right? You need to trust that I know what I'm talking about, because many patients, I think, if I say, hey, we've got a choice here, we can do A or do B, they may think, what a funny clinician that is, giving me choices. They don't know what they're doing. Well, actually, the reverse is true. I know a lot about those choices, but most patients feel, I expect the clinician to tell me what to do, not to give me problems, right? So creating the atmosphere of we're working as a team to solve this issue together, and I will never abandon you to have this decision alone. So that's a key step. Curiosity, compassion, empathy, kindness. So these are lots of the keys that open this very complicated safe space, in my view.
In this business of communication, and you've worked in the States, you've worked in the UK, and also in the Netherlands, my perception, and I may be completely wrong, is that the communication within clinical practice is very different. Is that an issue in the shared decision making?
Well, yeah, in the States, they do a lot of their communication standing up and walking around, actually, which I think is not ideal, right? You walk from one room to the next and see patients standing up when they're sitting down. I don't think that's ideal in my view. I'm a family doctor. I'm used to sharing a corner of a desk at least, right? So, but the patterns are very similar. The patterns is typically, because we don't see much shared decision making in most recordings that we do, right? And I've worked a lot with recordings. We don't see team talk. We don't see people saying, here's what we're trying to do, and I'm going to work with you as a team. We do see now more option talk, giving people choices. What we don't see is curiosity about your views. So, Domhnall, I told you about option A and B and C. Now I want to know how you react to those, and have you got any questions? I'm interested in your priorities, views, and preferences. And then I need to shut up. I need to really stop talking and give you a chance. And probably I need to stop talking for a few seconds at least, maybe more, because you are not going to be comfortable speaking to me unless I give you a lot of space and a lot of support and psychological safe ground to walk on. And so even though we see slightly different patterns of clinicians talking in different countries, we don't see team talk and we don't see decision talk without preference elicitation. We don't see it. Clinicians are blind to these two ways of talking.
Well, when you said the clinicians are blind to talking, that's a nice move on to another area I'd like to ask you about, and that is we've talked about clinical practice. We've talked about bringing these concepts into clinical practice. But are these concepts that you deal with in clinical practice, are they used in other spheres? Are they used in industry? And have you moved outside the clinical sphere with shared decision making?
I'm not really. I think psychotherapists use these techniques, right? So that's for sure. But they're a side of clinical practice, in my view, right? So psychologists, clinical therapists, clinical psychologists, and therapists, they do use these techniques of echoing, giving you time, pausing, being really curious about who you are, building up that psychological space. Do other industries do this? Well, they don't do it in this very detailed way, but it's interesting that the financial industry, if you go for financial advice, the first thing they will ask you about, what are your priorities in life? What are your values? Are you a risk taker? Are you risk averse? What's your future goals of the next 5 years or 10 years? So they will make a point of doing what many people are talking to me is missing in the three talk model, which is goal setting. What goals do you have? What are you trying to achieve? And goals, I think, are really complicated, Donald, because I wrote a paper a few years ago with a colleague from the Netherlands, splitting goals into ones about dealing with symptoms. I got a headache. I want to get rid of this headache. Function. I got this headache. I can't focus. I can't concentrate. And then fundamental goals. Actually, I'm trying to write a book, so I can't focus. I can't concentrate. I can't write this book, which is really important to me. So goals at symptomatic, function, and fundamental levels, trying to extract those from patients is difficult, especially the fundamental ones, because those are things that people hold very dear and often very private.
So let me finish off by reflecting those concepts back to you and say, what are the 5-year goals for Glyn Elwyn?
Well, I don't know. It's probably time I retired, but I don't really want to do that, actually. I don't think I've finished my work. So if I get closer to what I think is getting this idea into practice, I might give up one day.
Glyn, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I've just thoroughly enjoyed watching your career with a little bit of jealousy, I have to say, because it's been absolutely terrific. Thank you very much for talking to us today. It's been wonderful.
No, thank you for being in touch. Take care.